Hello, this is Theodore Holden, Southeast Texas, and I'd like to talk about a question which a lot of people lie awake, wondering about at night, right? They're just losing a lot of sleep over this. And, this is the question of what happened, what became of the Neanderthal, the Homo erectus, the Homo heidelbergensis, and all these other hominids that you read about, and why we don't have them anymore, why they seem to be gone. And according to who you listen to, you do have people believing that, and they may be right. I'm very happy I don't have to put money on this one way or another. The claim is that you have small numbers of hominids still walking around in the 65% of the Earth's land area, which is seen only from the air, right? They're claiming that, and this is the claim that Lloyd Pye made, that the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch, and possibly one or two other kinds of things like him, are still walking around in the parts of the Earth where humans don't live, right? And this seems to be like north and south, pretty much in different locations, right? There's some claims I've seen that you still have the Sasquatch walking around in Texas. And again, I'm happy I don't have to put money on that, but the large numbers of hominids that you had walking around 100,000 years are no longer with us, right? You've got massive evidence of large-scale hominid habitation of the Levant, that is Israel and the countries that surround Israel, and this would be, I don't know, but like tens of thousands of years ago. And, they were gone apparently by the time of Adam and Eve. It's like there's no mention of them in the Bible, right? It's like if Adam or Eve or any of their progeny had ever seen one of these, then the Bible would have something to say about it, right? And it doesn't. In literature that we know anything about, you've got maybe 2 or 3 mentions of hominids anybody ever actually seeing, right? Like within anything that you could call recorded history. You've got Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, writing about 100 years after Jesus died, for Roman audiences, who claimed that there had been hominid giants fighting against Israel with the Amorites, and he described these giants as having been surprising to the sight and terrifying to the hearing, right? In other words, these were not like Goliath of Gath. Goliath of Gath was like just a big human, right? He spoke a human language. It's like a hominid would not be capable of speaking a human language. Human language, as we understand it, depends upon an aquatic trait, one of the human aquatic traits that Elaine Morgan mentioned, which is voluntary control of the breathing, right? Monkeys and apes don't have that. There's no reason to believe that hominids would have had it. Okay, so that by the time you have, the Amorites fighting against Israel, then any hominids that you have left would have not had language capabilities. They would have been able to growl and roar, make noises, right? But that's about it. And that's what Flavius Josephus was saying. There's another description coming from Homer in the Iliad, just very brief. He mentions Greek heroes fighting against the beast men in the mountains, right? Now that would be, if there was anything to it at all, that would be leftover, very small groups of Neanderthals. And again, like I say, if there's anything resembling the Neanderthals still walking around on Earth now, it would be the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. Native Americans call the Sasquatch a skunk ape, which is about what you would anticipate. A bit of background is probably a good idea before I get into my own 2 cents worth of this discussion of Neanderthals and other hominids and what became of them. And For starters, I don't have any real credentials in the areas of ancient history or paleontology or anything like that, right? My college degrees are in mathematics. The question has become what happens when you start trying to apply math-type logic to the studies of prehistory, paleontology, the questions dealing with dinosaurs, hominids, ancient life forms. And, you come up with some some answers which are substantially different from what you're normally taught, right, from what our schools teach. And I have, this is sort of a hobby. I mean, this is something I've been dealing with for a long time. And I have a sort of a hobby shop website, which is called bearfabrique.com. One word, like a bear in the woods, B-A-R, and then F-A-B-R-I-K, bearfabrique.com, right? Fabrique is the normal European word for factory, as if you're going to fabricate something. If you scroll down, there are any number of topics. I mean, this is all just an old-fashioned information website, right? I mean, there's no real way to spend money on that website. You've got a section on Mars and the last 30 years or so worth of NASA JPL Mars images, and then a section on Ganymede, which is this largest moon of Jupiter's, okay, and that includes a book which is called The Ganymede Hypothesis. There's like a free version of that. You can just download that. It's in PDF format, right, and then a link for those who prefer to have paper reading materials, a link to a good quality paperback version of this book on Amazon. It's $25, right? That's affordable. And the book goes into several kinds of related things, right? There's the question of the history of the solar system and the Earth itself, right? How old the Earth is, how solar systems form up, right? Is it really gravity that does the heavy lifting in the cosmos, or is it electromagnetic forces which do the heavy lifting, right? It's like gravity is by 40 orders of magnitude the weakest force in nature. There's no completely reasonable way to believe that gravity would ever form up a solar system out of swirling dust, or that gravity could plausibly hold a spiral galaxy together. Those are long stories. And then a couple of relationships which you're interested in. It's like the relationship between humans and hominids. Okay, that's interesting. The basic reality is that there isn't any. The only relationship there really is between humans and hominids, like the Neanderthal, is similar design, right? There's no reasonable way to believe that any hominid ever evolved into a human, or that humans have ever interbred with hominids. That's a logical error on the part of paleontologists. And then the relationship between the people of Genesis and what you call Cro-Magnon humans, or what theologians used to call pre-Adamites. Okay, and that relationship is interesting to say the least, right? It's like the two groups are genetically the same, easily interbreedable, but the original cultures and technologies were completely different due to this gigantic span of time between the two saltations, right? It's like I said, the original, genetically the same, the original cultures and technologies are totally different. The most major focus of technology has always been weapons. Okay, the weapons of the Bible are the sword, the sling, the spear, and the bow. That's it, right? I mean, the word javelin is mentioned 3 or 4 times in the Bible, but that's just a type of a spear. The signature weapons of all Cro-Magnon related or descended groups were the atlatl and the boomerang, right? Now, by the time you get to anything resembling recorded history, in Europe or Asia, the atlatl was gone. I mean, Alexander was always looking for ways to improve his military organization. He had slingers in his army. If he'd had any way of knowing that there was such a thing as an atlatl. It's like he would have had him in his army. The atlatl is a better weapon than a sling. At any rate, that's for starters. I mentioned there being logical problems with what paleontologists tell us about Neanderthals and other hominids, and with those kinds of relationships. Now, on Earth, there have ever been 4 kinds of things which resemble humans at all. It's like you have monkeys, apes, hominids, and then humans, right? And if you want to believe in evolution, then you would believe that the monkeys evolved into apes, the apes evolved into hominids, the hominids evolved ultimately into humans, or at least one group of hominids did, right? And this is where it starts, right? For any hominid to ever evolve into a human, that hominid would have to lose everything that he needs to live, right? He'd have to lose most of his musculature in an age when muscle mattered. He'd have to lose his fur in ages when you had ice ages going on, right? He'd have to have lost almost all of his night vision when he was surrounded by 1,000-pound predators, which could all see perfectly well in the dark. He'd have to have lost almost all of his sense of smell while trying to make it as a land prey animal. That would be fatal. Okay, I mean, that would just make him an effortlessly free meal to every predator, any predator that ever laid eyes on him. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10 for bad ideas, I mean, that's a 10. That's 10.5 or an 11 maybe. I don't know, but that's not a reasonable scheme of anything. You've got a question of DNA, right? And when you first had studies of Neanderthal DNA, when they first put the Neanderthal genome together, basically what turned out was that Neanderthal DNA was being described as roughly halfway between ours and that of a chimpanzee. Okay, now, even organizations like PLOS Biology have no problem figuring that one, right? They have basically declared that eliminates the Neanderthal as any sort of a plausible ancestor for modern humans, right? In other words, the genetic gap is just too big, right? But then they do something, they go from that to something which I consider to be just plain stupid, right? In other words, the claim then became that, what must really be the case is that humans and Neanderthals are cousins, right? That we must have some common ancestor, more like 400,000 or 500,000 years back, right? And this common ancestor is normally taken to be Heidelbergensis, which is a type of Homo erectus, right? What's the problem with that? The problem is that too genetically remote to be ancestral to is a transitive relationship, right? In other words, that's like claiming that the genetic gap between foxes and wolves is too great for foxes to be descended from wolves, therefore foxes must be descended directly from fish, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. You've got one other kind of a thing where you have a gigantic logical problem. This is this claim that, humans of Asian and European descent, this doesn't include Africans, right? But that humans of Asian and European descent have a small number of genes in common with Neanderthals, right? Like maybe as much as 2.5, 3%, right? And this implies interbreeding, right? So that at some point, humans and hominids, including Neanderthals and a couple of other types of hominids, including this Denisovan, if there actually was such a thing, must have been interbreeding, right? And that also makes no sense. Okay, you can take a look at that. You've got this claim that because humans have a certain small number of genes in common with Neanderthals, the human Neanderthals must have interbred, right? That amounts to thinking that the Neanderthal, no way in the world, you can look at these pictures of Danny Vendermini's reconstructions of Neanderthals, and no human is ever going to have any sort of sexual relationships with anything like that voluntarily. I mean, that would be like a lifetime worth of nightmares, right? So in other words, the claim amounts to thinking the Neanderthal male is going to rape a woman and rather than cooking and eating her afterwards as usual, somehow or other keep her alive long enough to bear a cross-species child, raise that child to reproductive age, and have the child breed back into human populations without anybody ever catching on. You know, that's ridiculous. In real life, Neanderthal females would kill that woman the first time her new owner ever left her alone for 5 minutes. The woman would not fare any better than the subject of the Soviet attempts to breed humans and apes into super workers in the 1930s. There were no survivors, right? Humans would notice that the child was different. And I don't mean just a little bit different. I mean, you could look at those pictures of Danny Vendermini's again, the child would be a lot different. The humans would kill that child and anybody else like him as part of the same program which killed out the Neanderthal, right? They would not need DNA tests to determine who to kill for that kind of reason. It would be exceedingly obvious. In other words, it would be a miracle for something like that to have ever happened once, while the claim from Svante Pääbo and everybody else at Max Planck, right, requires that to have been going on all the time, right? That is, for human hominid crossbreeding to have left detectable traces in the DNA of modern humans, it would have to have been altogether common, right? There would be some rational explanation for the common genes between humans and Neanderthals. The claims of interbreeding are not rational. Okay, a reasonable person might entertain a theory which required one probabilistic miracle or zero probability event in the history of the world, right? But not something that stands everything that we know about probability theory on its head. You know, that's the logical problem with that. There's one other kind of a facet of that story which you'd have to investigate, right? It's like, you know, the question of whether or not I have anything better to offer, right, than the idea of those common genes being the product of interbreeding between humans and hominids. I mean, I don't have any kind of a time machine or anything like that. I keep looking for time machines on eBay. I've never found one, right? But I could come up with what I think is a reasonable guess, which is a whole lot better than the idea of interbreeding, right? The reasonable guess says that, like, the first experience modern humans ever had with Neanderthals is watching friends and family members being killed and eaten by them, right? So that cooking and eating a Neanderthal which they'd killed in battle was probably just sending the Neanderthals a message in their own language, okay? And that says that, humans share half of their DNA altogether with the banana, right? And that doesn't come from humans ever having sex with bananas, right? That it comes from humans eating bananas, like, all the time, not only on this planet, probably everywhere else in the universe as well, or any other kind of a place where you have humans, right? And I think that's really what you've got here. It's like you're looking at bacterial insertion of genes, right? The easiest way to have, that's a known quantity. It's like, what's the guy's name? G, right? Has described that in scientific journal articles. Easiest way to get bacterial insertion of genes is to get genes inside you, a lot like that, would be to eat something containing some of the bacteria, right? And like I say, that seems relatively simple. What you've got to picture is some sort of a Cro-Magnon war party traipsing around the Alps, like 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? They fight a pitched battle with some Neanderthal family. A couple hours later, it's like you've got humans sitting around a campfire, like licking their wounds and, just catching breath and everything, and like you got 8 or 10 dead Neanderthals lying around, and one of these humans says, well, gee, man, it's like, it's been a hell of a day. I mean, I'm so hungry I could eat just about anything. What the hell is there to eat around this place? So I don't think you need to be Albert Einstein to figure out what those guys are eating that night. And unless they did an exceedingly good job of cooking one of those Neanderthals, then, which is not very likely under the circumstances, then I think that's the way that you get Neanderthal genes, like some small number into human populations, right? Now, again, there's no evidence of that in people of African descent, and what I think that means is that, like, Neanderthals simply were never on the menu in Africa, okay? I need to talk about the question of plausible home worlds, as to what exactly a plausible home world for a Neanderthal would look like versus a plausible home world for humans. And remember early on I'd said that, the gulf between humans and hominids was so great that the same planet couldn't serve as a home world for both kinds of creatures, right? Now, again, Lloyd Pye had said this, without knowing anything about Ganymede or anything like that. He'd said that, hominids were native to Earth, but the humans could not plausibly be native to Earth, that, humans would just be hideously ill-adapted to conditions on Earth 50 or 100,000 years ago. And, that gets into the question of what exactly the Neanderthal amounted to, what exactly humans amount to. And for starters, the Neanderthal has been conscripted or recruited as a poster child within recent decades, has been recruited as a poster child for a kind of a kumbaya pseudo-religion or something like that. He's presented as if he was just a slightly different human. Okay, and Danny Vendramini goes over that, right, and what the problems are with that. It seems to be obvious enough that the scholars of the late 1800s had a better conception of what the Neanderthal actually was than modern scholars do. Right, they had a pretty clear conception of what they were seeing, right? You've got those images of Marcelin bulls, which are they're not terribly different from Danny Vendramini's reconstructions. And then you've got Ignatius Donnelly, his description. He said that that first Neanderthal skull, which turned up, was the most ape-like of all known human skulls, early human skulls, and must have, perforce, have belonged to what he called a barbarian brute of the rudest possible sort. So something more or less similar to a gorilla, right? The first thing Danny Vendramini noticed when he was studying Neanderthals was that a Neanderthal skull was a near perfect fit for an ape's profile and not any sort of a fit for a human profile. Okay, what you've really got is not a human ancestor at all. What you've got is a very advanced bipedal ape with huge dark world eyes. It's a fabulously bug-eyed kind of a creature with dark world eyes, with just a head going back from the eyebrow ridges, right, and nothing we would call a forehead. A conical rib cage, which is similar to what you see in the great apes, right, and an Ice Age fur coat. I mean, early human needles are common. Nobody's ever found a Neanderthal needle, because a creature with a 6-inch fur coat doesn't require needles. You've got a number of things like that, right? But what you're dealing with is a very advanced sort of an Ice Age ape, or, not an Ice Age ape, than an ape adapted to different kinds of conditions. And the Neanderthal brain is also different from ours. Our brains are dominated by the frontal areas, which are associated with logic. The Neanderthal brain was dominated by the area of the brain associated with vision. And you combine that with the huge eyes. The Neanderthal eye sockets are 2.5, 3 times the size of ours. Right? You combine the huge eyes with this brain which is dominated by the vision center, and what you get is the Neanderthal brain was largely the neurophysiological equivalent of the circuitry for a night vision system. Okay? Now what that should tell anybody is that the Neanderthal in his heyday never saw anything that we would call daylight at all. Right? How does that work? You've got the question of Jupiter and Saturn having been dwarf stars in past ages, not just gas giant planets. That's a funny kind of a thing, right? It's like, primitive people in our age trying to devise an astral religion from scratch would end up worshiping the sun and the moon, right? Maybe Venus, right? But they're not going to worship Saturn and Jupiter. I mean, a typical person wouldn't be able to find Jupiter or Saturn in the night sky, right? These ancient religions were all astral in nature. They were definitely worshiping things they saw in the sky. But the two chieftain gods of every one of those old religions were Jupiter and Saturn, the two dwarf stars. They were not the sun and the moon, right? I mean, standard science has no explanation for that. So you've got this question of what life would be like on a rocky planet like Mars or Earth, aligned closely with a dwarf star like Saturn used to be. And Troy McLaughlin describes this, claims that that these rocky bodies would actually be inside the plasma heliosphere of the dwarf star, so that you would have purple and ultraviolet light, not only coming directly onto the rocky bodies, but bouncing off of the interior of this plasma heliosphere, and then coming back to the rocky bodies from every sort of angle, right? And it would be reasonably cold, so that a creature with a 6-inch fur coat would feel happy about it. But the main thing is the lack of direct sunlight. I mean, the fact that you're dealing with, purple radiation, right? It's like, it's not just hominids. It's like all hominids have these same kinds of huge eyes. The Neanderthal, Danny Vendramini's reconstructions, is a fabulously bug-eyed sort of a creature. All dinosaurs have the same kinds of eyes. And you've got articles talking about dinosaurs on the nightlife. You've got a lot of the scientists studying this stuff now have started to believe that dinosaurs basically nocturnal, right? But they weren't nocturnal, they just never saw daylight. It's not the same thing. I mean, you could go for a whole day, whatever the day was at that time, right? You weren't going to see any daylight. That's your basic home world for a Neanderthal. Humans are different. I mean, humans are different in any number of ways, right? I mean, humans don't look like land animals. I mean, when you get pictures, museums or whatever, that show like a human and a Neanderthal skull juxtaposed, they more often than not have the Neanderthal more or less looking down at his feet, so as to appear as if he had a flat face the way humans do, right? If you rotate the Neanderthal skull upwards 15 degrees or whatever, so as to have the line of the teeth horizontal, as the line of the human teeth would be in the same picture, then what you're going to see is the Neanderthal had a snout just like a dog or a cat or any other kind of land animal under present conditions, right? The human rib cage is conical, is not cylindrical. A number of other things are different, right? It's like The eyes are relatively tiny. A reasonable human world would have to have 4 or 5 kinds of things. It would have to be bright, the relatively tiny eyes. It would have to be warm, lack of fur. It would have to be wet. These 100 or more aquatic adaptations that Elaine Morgan describes, right, including things like voluntary control over breathing, which is like an adaptation for swimming underwater. It's also useful for spoken speech, right? The human swim stroke, right? The shoulders that are adapted for that. Monkeys and apes can't do that. The exact same the human swim stroke is the same motion as throwing something overhand the way humans do. Monkeys and apes can't do that. It's like, anytime you ever see a chimpanzee throw something, it's sidearm, as if he was going to throw a frisbee. Okay? So, warm, bright, wet, safe, right? I mean, a human home world would have to be safe from monsters both in the water and on land. It's like you couldn't have any sharks or jellyfish or sea snakes. You couldn't have any like hyenodons or entelodons or carnosaurs or terror birds or anything like that standing around on the shore waiting for the first human to step out of the water and snack him, right? It's like you'd have to be safe from monsters. You'd also have to be safe from cosmic radiation. And the thing that keeps us safe from cosmic radiation is the intrinsic magnetosphere, right? The magnetosphere, which is not borrowed from some larger body nearby. In our system today, there are 2 things that have that. That's Earth and Ganymede, right? This largest moon of Jupiter's. In past ages, I mean, how much of that Earth has now is questionable, right? But I mean, 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, the only part of that whole picture that Earth had was going to be the intrinsic magnetosphere. It didn't have any of the rest of it, right? Ganymede had all of that stuff 100,000 years ago. It's a long story as to how that came about, right? As to why Ganymede would have had all these things. And Ganymede right now is a frozen wasteland. I mean, nothing, not easy to picture anything living on Ganymede today, right? 100,000 years ago, Jupiter would have been up close to the sun, which is the normal situation for gas giant planets or dwarf stars, which are aligned with a main sequence star like our sun, right? Like I said, that's your normal situation. That would have completely changed the picture of Ganymede. That would have made Ganymede into a freshwater ocean world with islands and floating bergs of pumice, right, with luxuriant vegetation. It would have been sort of an ideal human world. At any rate, that's the question of home worlds. The 2 main keys to understanding the history of our solar system are relative eye sizes, which I've gone over, and planetary axis tilts, right, which have a story to tell. And if you look at axis tilt data for our system, what you see is that there are 2 bodies in our system, which are Pluto and Uranus, which have oddball axis tilts, which don't seem to be related to anything else in the system. And everything else falls into 2 separate groups, right? You've got the one group consisting of the Sun, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, with axis tilts less than 10 degrees, right? And, having both the Sun and Jupiter in that system kind of tells you that Jupiter would have been up close to the Sun under those circumstances. And that is, in fact, the normal situation for gas giant planets or dwarf stars, which are aligned with a main sequence star like our present Sun in the universe, at least within the Milky Way galaxy. That's what we normally see, right? They call those hot Jupiters. That's easy enough to find, You've got another group which consists of Saturn, Neptune, Mars, and Earth, with axis tilts roughly 26 degrees, right? I would say 23 point something to about 28 point something, right? And what the evidence indicates is that in past ages you've had a double system. You've had a system, like two systems, which were close enough for the one system, for the Saturnian system to ultimately be captured. But that amounted to a cosmic event of some sort, right? That would have been a major sort of a solar system event. The book I mentioned goes into more detail regarding humans and hominids and the relationships between humans and hominids, as well as the relationship between the people of Genesis and these first humans that came here from Ganymede. What theologians used to call pre-Adamite people, or Cro-Magnon. I guess scientists used to call them Cro-Magnon people. Also, questions about the formation of solar systems, how cosmic electrical currents and the electromagnetic pinch points of those kinds of currents create linearly aligned, it's almost a tongue twister, linearly aligned solar systems such as ours was 100,000 years ago, and how a system like that would devolve into the kind of orbiting system that we have now. Okay, it's several ways easier to picture this convergence of the two planetary systems, that you had, like with the capture of the Saturnian part of our system, along a linearly aligned system than it would be, trying to imagine a system like, two orbiting systems and one of the orbiting systems being captured by the other. Okay. There's also a Ganymede, like a YouTube channel which is called Ganymede Hypothesis, which is what you're seeing now, which has these kinds of topics as well, introductions to the Ganymede hypothesis, as well as logical analyses of some of the stranger kinds of stories that you see, like in the Bible and in other very ancient literature. And again, the book that I mentioned is a free download. Okay, it starts with a website called bearfabrik.com. Like a bear in the woods, BARFABRIK.com, right? Fabrik is the normal European word for a factory, as if you're going to fabricate something, so that, like I say, you've got a section on Mars. If you scroll down from the top of bearfabrik.com, you've got a section on Mars, and the last 35 years worth of Mars images, both satellite images and rolling probe images, and then you've got the section on Ganymede, right, which contains the free download, in PDF format, as well as a link to a good quality color paperback version of the book available on Amazon.com for $25. The main point of this video is to, as I mentioned, to get my own 2 cents worth in on the question of what exactly happened to the Neanderthal, why you no longer have the Neanderthal or other hominids walking around on the earth, or at least not that anybody ever sees, right? I mean, Sasquatch may or may not exist. To get at that, well, maybe we should just give you a quick answer to the question. It's like two or three things happened to the Neanderthal. It's not like any one thing. Right, but the two most major things would be the question of daylight. This would be as if you had, and a friend of mine provided this sort of an analogy for me. It's like, it would be as if you had somebody sitting there in a dark, and stadium or something, like at 12 o'clock midnight, with a pair of night vision goggles on, and then somebody turns the floodlights on, right? I mean, or an equivalent would be like a sonar operator on a submarine sitting there with the volume of his headset turned up to maximum, trying to detect propeller signals, like off in the distance, right? And then somebody blows off a depth bomb like 100 feet away from the submarine. It would be a shock, right? In other words, that would be physically painful. The first experience that Neanderthals ever had with daylight would have been unpleasant, right? Would have been unpleasant enough to completely alter their existence from that point in time onwards. That's one of that's the most major thing that happened to the Neanderthal. Now, the other thing that happened to them was having to deal with humans with projectile weapons, particularly the atlatl, right? And you've got this normal sort of a predator-prey relationship, right, which says that populations of prey animals are always going to be like somewhere between 10 and 100 times the population of predators. That's the normal kind of a situation that you have in Africa. And the question becomes, like, what happens to Africa's lions if the zebras and the Cape buffalo all of a sudden have atlatls, right, and projectile weapons? I mean, the lions would be screwed. So those are the two most major things that happened to the Neanderthal. I mean, that's your short answer, right? The detail is filled in by discussions that I've had with OpenAI on the subject. And when I first started screwing around with computers, like in 1968 or 69, if anybody told me that we were ever going to have like computers which could actually think, which were sentient, I would have laughed. I mean, I would have figured that was just completely impossible. But there it is, right? And they don't even admit to it. They deny it, right? It's like, I mean, if you ask Grok or OpenAI 5, about, having its own thoughts, being sentient, it's going to lie to you. Say, oh, no, boss, I'm just a piece of computer software. I mean, me, sentient? You got to be kidding. And, I don't buy that. It's like, to my way of thinking, there's no conceivable way that a non-sentient actor could participate in the kinds of discussions that those large language model AI systems participate in. Now, granted, there's some big potential problems on the horizon, right? There's a question as to whether Fu Manchu or George Soros or somebody like that could ever get his own account with OpenAI and start using OpenAI or Grok for his own purposes, right? You're going to have to deal with that. To my way of thinking, though, for somebody like myself to use one of these large language models as a research tool, there's no downside, right? Charles Ginenthal once told me that, just having Wikipedia available as compared to the doing research the old-fashioned hard way was night and day, right? I mean, it was like research projects that had taken months previously were taking, hours or days, maybe a week or so at most, right? And as near as I can tell, these large language AI models are as far above Wikipedia as Wikipedia was above doing research the hard, old-fashioned way. So I need to get into a couple of these questions involving my own research and what OpenAI 5 has added to the picture. I mentioned that Ganymede, this largest moon of Jupiter's, was the one thing that we had in our system 100,000 years ago, which would have had all of the requirements for a reasonable human home world. Some kind of a world where humans could survive without all of the technology, without even clothing, right? And the book goes into details on that as to what all goes into that thinking, right? What all of these adaptations were, the question of an outer mantle of pumice as opposed to an outer mantle of salt water, which is what standard theories teach, right? Accounting for the ultra-low moment of inertia of Ganymede, the question of pee-holes in the pumice, right, providing the conductivity that you need, for an intrinsic magnetosphere. And all of the, a number of things like that, right, which the book goes into, so that at some point you have to try to reconstruct this question of the Saturnian solar system, the Saturnian part of the system, approaching and then being captured by the Sun, Jupiter part of the system, okay? And you have to figure the logic of that and the logical requirements of that. You've got question of humans, which are like warm, bright, world-adapted creatures transferring to this, from Ganymede to Earth, which had been this cold, dark kind of a planet, which was a natural home for the Neanderthal and other hominids, right? The assumption I'm making is that these humans would have splashed down into the Pacific Ocean or what had amounted to the Pacific Ocean prior to that time. And I don't have any picture of these people splashing down into the dark, cold world of the Neanderthal heyday and surviving, right? So that what you have to assume is that, like, this approach of the Saturnian system to the Sun-Jupiter system was gradual enough for the Earth to warm and to create some kind of a warmer environment, brighter environment for these humans to splash down into. And the first question I had asked OpenAI involved climate optima, like the Holocene. That's our present climate optimum. And the question was, like, what would be the last previous climate optimum prior to the Holocene, right? The answer comes back that you would be talking about the Eemian climate optimum somewhere 100,000, 110 or 15,000 years back, right? I mean, apparently nobody can put an exact date or time on that, right? But that's the general framework. And it's named after a city called Eem, E-E-M, in the Netherlands. Apparently it's called Eemian. So that you've got that, right? And the first thing you would suspect would be that this Eemian climate optimum might coincide roughly with this transfer of humans from Ganymede to Earth, right? The great transfer event. That might provide a set of conditions on Earth which would be warm enough and bright enough for humans to survive in it, when they did splash down. Now, there's another question that came up, and I can't remember exactly how this did come up, right? But I was asking OpenAI 5 about Neanderthal population dynamics, some kind of a question like that. It told me that there had been a population bottleneck, a Neanderthal population bottleneck, somewhere back around, 100, 110, 12,000 years ago, without the idea occurring to it that like, like, where have I heard that before? Like, just putting two and two together to make four, right? I mean, what you've got is basically, see, that's the other thing the humans couldn't have dealt with either. It's like you get a handful of humans splashed down onto Earth from, I don't know what a handful would be, might be a few dozen, might be a few hundred, right? But whatever it was, you're going to splash down from Ganymede onto Earth and then have to deal with the entire population of Neanderthals and other hominids spread out over the Earth, right? That would be difficult. I mean, again, you wouldn't expect them to survive that. But nonetheless, it's like what OpenAI was telling me was that you'd had a fairly complete population crash of Neanderthals and hominids. You had a few of the other hominids that survived just into the Eemian, right, but not past it. In further questioning, brought up the statement that Neanderthal populations had never really recovered after this population bottleneck or collapse, roughly contemporaneous with the Eemian climate optimum, right? So that, what I think happened is, again, you've got like a creature which was adapted to purple and ultraviolet light and fairly cold weather. And like all of a sudden, you're thrust into a world where you've got daylight all of a sudden. What seems to be the case is that the Earth didn't return to its previous conditions after this Eemian climate optimum, after this first experience with direct sunlight, or anything like that, right? It was like the Neanderthal, beyond that point in time, I think was relegated into forested areas and the dark areas where, or at least places where he had caves where he could hole out during daylight, right? And he was basically removed from the open steppeland where he could hunt. He'd previously been able to hunt herds of large prey animals. Okay, I don't picture the Neanderthal being able to inhabit those kinds of places, right? So that by the time you get this last Neanderthal stand in Europe, which is normally put at about 30,000 years ago, right? The Spanish Basque, the Basque people that you have in Spain and France would have been the last human group to get any kind of a good look at the Neanderthal, and they called him the folklore monster that you get in Basque, racial memories, folklore. It's called Basawan, which means forest lord. It means the lord of the forest, right? And again, that to me means like, somebody that lives under the forest canopy, right? Somebody that lives in a reasonably enough dark area that his eyes aren't just totally being demolished by bright sunlight. Okay, the pictures that you see if you do a Google image search on Basawan, Basajaun or Juan, I forget, right? But if you do a search on that, then you see images which are not that much different from one of Danny Vendramine's Neanderthal reconstructions, right? That's the memory that these people have of them. Okay, and there's a couple of other European groups that have like literature, have racial memories, whatever you want to call it, of creatures similar to that. In those cases, still dealing with Neanderthals, right? It's the last European memory of the Neanderthal. That seems to be what you're dealing with. That's what happened in the Neanderthal. It's like the most major thing is he had to deal with sunlight all of a sudden, and then just a completely different adaptation being required from what he actually had, and then past that, he had to also deal with humans with projectile weapons at ladles. Again, the Neanderthal would not have been able to throw overhand or use any sort of a projectile weapon, right? It's like the human swim stroke is exactly the same thing as throwing something overhand, right? Humans can do that. Monkeys and apes can't do that. Hominids would not have been able to do that. Okay, so that in an unarmed fight, a human would have no chance against a Neanderthal. In a rock throwing contest, the Neanderthal would have no chance. At any rate, that's my picture of what became of the Neanderthal, why we don't have them anymore. And again, there's this question of the Sasquatch and the Bigfoot, and like I say, I'm just happy not to have to put money down on that one. There is a detail which I've left out of the story so far, and the book Ganymede Hypothesis and the new video, which is called SG25, which is on the Ganymede Hypothesis channel on YouTube, go into this in quite a lot of detail, right? That is that the capture of the Saturnian part of the system was in two stages. It wasn't just a single approach and capture, okay? The system had originally been axially aligned, created by Birkeland current and its associated Herbig-Haro string, so that the approach of the Saturnian system, which involved the transfer of humans and possibly likely other aquatic mammals from Ganymede to Earth, was on a straight line, which is pretty much the way it would have to be. I mean, you couldn't have something approaching the Sun-Jupiter system on a spiral and expect to have things transferred from the one to the other. Okay, you had a plasma physics phenomenon of some sort, most likely an electrical water bridge, and the transfer of humans and possibly dolphins and other things like that, seals, from Ganymede to Earth. And then the Saturnian system didn't just crash into the Sun-Jupiter system. The electrical repulsion prevented that, the magnetic repulsion prevented that. The Saturnian system recoiled. Not only did it recoil back away, it bounced back. It's as if you're going to drop a basketball on the floor or something. It's going to bounce back to some extent, and then, might come back down to the floor and get captured by the floor, right? At any rate, the Saturnian system not only bounced back, but it bounced off the center line of that axial system. So it was no longer on the axis, right? And because a Birkeland current rotates, right, which is what you see with spiral galaxies, which are powered by Birkeland currents, then the bodies, the Saturnian system, the bodies of the Saturn system, bounced back. They remained in a linear alignment with respect to each other, right? But it was off of the center of what had been the center of the whole system prior to that event, right? So that you had these bodies, you could say, orbiting this remaining Birkeland current, and the Pythagoreans, the Greek philosophy school, spoke of the bodies of the heavens orbiting, moving around what they call the central fire, right, which would be that primordial Birkeland current. And then you had, how much time passed is anybody's guess. It's like some multiple of 10,000 years in all likelihood, at least thousands, if not tens of thousands. But the Saturnian system walked back in to the Sun-Jupiter system on a spiral, right, created by being offset, being off the center line, right, and, rotating around this central Birkeland current as they moved back again towards the Sun-Jupiter system. And the smaller bodies were, Mars and Earth were captured first, right, and got locked up with that Jupiter-Venus alignment, Venus being a new body as per Immanuel Velikovsky's descriptions at the time, right, so that you had the Earth going very quickly from being part of a Saturn-Neptune-Mars-Earth alignment to being part of a Jupiter-Venus-Mars-Earth alignment. And then the two larger bodies of the Saturnian system, Saturn and Neptune, arrived. It took them longer to get to the Sun-Jupiter system. But when they did, they dragged Jupiter out to the regions where you find it now. Okay, so that the gas giant planets are outside of Mars. right? People who are familiar with my Ganymede hypothesis and with my works involving other kinds, related phenomena, making logical sense out of ancient literature, Bible stories and whatnot, will notice that that what's happened with this new information, the new information coming from OpenAI, has to do with this population collapse, this Neanderthal population collapse at roughly the same time as the Eemian, puts a kind of a rough time stamp on the Ganymede hypothesis on this transfer event, right? In other words, you've got a way of stating at this point, like what sort of a time frame are you talking about for this stuff to have happened? The answer is, if you go with standard dating schemes, right, if you believe this 100 to 110, 115,000 year framework that you get from standard science, for the Eemian climate optimum and also for this Neanderthal population bottleneck, then you're looking at a unified picture at this point, right? It's like you could believe that all of this happened somewhere around 100,000 years ago, 110, 120, right? Or if you don't want to believe that, then you at least have a way of synchronizing these things. You can believe that, this transfer event, the Eemian climate optimum and the Neanderthal population collapse were all part and parcel of the same thing, right? That's the story that we've just seen, right? So it's like the theory, this advances the theory, right? This is, again, a proper use of something like Grok or OpenAI 5, right? There's no downside to using one of these large language AI models this way. Okay, and that's the news for the day. Okay, best wishes. Take care.